Welcome to this lesson on indirect statements. In it, you will learn how to recognize the various parts of an indirect statement in a Latin sentence. In this section of the lesson, we will be looking at the components of a sentence containing an indirect statement. In English and in Latin, an indirect statement begins with a trigger verb. These are verbs of saying, knowing, perceiving, and thinking. In an English sentence, the trigger verb will always occur after the subject, like it does in this sample, immediately following the word mother. In a Latin sentence, the trigger verb may come after the subject, but it may appear elsewhere in the sentence. Like in this example, it appears at the very end. The very end of a sentence is a very common position for a Latin verb. Do not be surprised if you find the trigger verb at the end of the sentence instead of at the beginning. Now let's look at the next component of a sentence containing an indirect statement. In English, you will always see the word that following the trigger verb. It introduces the indirect statement. Latin does not have a word for that, which will be used to introduce the indirect statement. Instead, the indirect statement is recognized by the fact that the verb in the indirect statement is written in an infinitive form. This may sometimes be after the trigger verb, or if the trigger verb is at the end of the sentence, it will come in front of it. In this part of the lesson, we will continue to look at the components of a sentence containing an indirect statement. In English, what will we see after the word that? You might recall that I explained that in English, the portion of the sentence that follows that, her son did not read the book, which I've placed in brackets, is really the direct object of the sentence. We know it's the direct object because when you ask the question what after the verb told, we can answer it by saying the mother told what? Her son did not read the book. This makes it the direct object. Understanding this will be important as we move to the Latin sentence and see how the Latin will differ from English when we find or after we find the infinitive. We need to understand that what we are really looking at is the direct object. Therefore, we are looking for an accusative case noun because accusative marks the direct object of a sentence. This accusative case noun is in fact the subject of the infinitive. You may sometimes see more than one accusative case noun, like we do in this sentence, filium and librum. What you want to understand is that the Roman author will use the first accusative case noun, filium, as the subject of the verb, making filium legere and all the words that go with it the direct object of the verb told. Now we are going to examine Latin sentences and determine the various parts of an indirect statement. First, let's see if we can find the trigger verb. You should recognize that putant, which is from puto, putara, putavi, putatum, to think, is the trigger verb. After you find the trigger verb, remember that you want to look for the infinitive that follows the trigger verb. Hopefully you noticed esse, which is the present active infinitive of sum esse fui, is the infinitive of or following our trigger verb and the verb of the indirect statement. Now you want to find the accusative case noun that serves as the subject of the infinitive and the direct object of the sentence. Notice that we have both pueros and molestos in the accusative case. Molestos is from molestus which is an adjective. We want a noun to serve as the subject of the indirect statement, so that word will be pueros. It is the subject of the indirect statement. It, together with essa, form the direct object of the verb putant. Now let's look at a new sentence. Cibum bonum futurum esse spero. Can you find the trigger verb? If you thought spero is the trigger verb, you are correct. Now it's time to find the infinitive, which will follow the trigger verb. Can you find it? Are you surprised to see that it is not just the word esse, but futurum esse? Remember that futurum esse is the future active infinitive of sum esse fui, to be. Finally, it's time to look for the accusative case word, which will be used as the subject of the infinitive and the direct object of the trigger verb spero. Notice that we have both cibum and bonum in the accusative case. Bonum is from bonus the adjective which means good. Remember from our last sentence that we want the noun to serve as the subject of the infinitive, so cibum is the accusative case noun. It together with esse and all the words in between it make the indirect statement. What's the subject of spero, the trigger verb? I, which is found by the ending of the verb. Let's go on to look at a new sentence. Rex reginam mortuam esse nuntiavit. Can you find the trigger verb? If you said that nuntiavit is the trigger verb, you are correct. Notice that it ends with T, and that gives us a clue about its subject. What is the subject? He, she, it. But remember that he, she, it can also be a noun. Notice that rex, which is in the nominative case, is separated from the verb nuntiavit. But because it is in the nominative case, it is actually the subject of our verb. Remember that the indirect statement is really nothing more than a direct object. The verb in that part of the sentence is written like an infinitive. Can you see the infinitive? It's esse, from sum esse fui, the verb to be. That is where our indirect statement ends. And we know that rex is the subject of our verb nuntiavit. So that means that anything that comes after rex has to be inside of the indirect statement. Based on that, do you know which accusative case word is the subject of esse? Remember that everything between rex, the subject, and nuntiavit, the verb, is the indirect statement. Mortuam, which is accusative, is from the adjective mortuosa which means that reginam is the accusative case noun that serves as the subject of the indirect statement and the subject of the infinitive. Now I'm going to ask you to do some practice on your own using a set of Quizlet flashcards which immediately follows this video. In it you will be asked to practice finding the parts of an indirect statement just like we've done here.